It gives me enormous pleasure to introduce Alan Packwood OBE. Not only is Alan a great friend of the entire Churchill family, but he has done the most wonderful job conserving, indexing, and restoring all Sir Winston's papers and photographs, and also Lady Churchill's.
Well, Minnie, thank you so much for that very kind introduction. And let me just very quickly reciprocate, because I know that I speak for all of the Churchill institutions and charities when I say that we benefit enormously and all the time from the advice, the support, and the generosity of the Churchill family. So I'd like to thank all of the members of the Churchill family here today. Now, there's absolutely no doubt that Winston Churchill would have loved the setting for this conference in colonial Williamsburg, but there is one thing that might just have taken him aback slightly. As I entered the main foyer this morning, the first thing that I saw was one of those pop-up panels. And it wasn't for this conference, it was actually for the other conference that's taking place here today. And that panel simply said, "The gold standard is back." Now, lots of people have asked me why I decided to write another book about Churchill's war leadership. And it seems to me that's a fair question, because it must be the most studied and written about period of what is undoubtedly a very heavily studied and written about life. And I have to say that if I'd known when I started the book, that it would end up coming out at the same time as Andrew Roberts' great new biography, I might not have started it at all. But I think I wrote primarily for the best of reasons, I hope for the best of reasons, which was to satisfy my own curiosity. A lot of what you see and read about Winston Churchill outside of gatherings like these, it seems to me, is very superficial and very black and white. He is the scowling bulldog war leader with the V for victory salute and the omnipresent cigar, who turned the British wartime establishment on its head and whose oratory gave the lion's roar that imbued the British people with the will to fight. He's become an icon, celebrated on the new British £5 note, where the hands of Big Ben are permanently frozen at 3 p.m., commemorating the moment that he finished delivering his blood, toil, tears, and sweat speech, his first parliamentary address as Prime Minister, in which he famously promised victory at all costs, victory in spite of all terror, victory however long and hard the road may be. Yet, of course, behind the icon was a man, and behind the rhetoric was a question. How? How could and would Churchill seek to deliver that victory? His 6-minute speech on the 13th of May was an oratorical masterpiece, but it contained no details of strategy or policy. So, that was my starting point. That was the question that I wanted to try and answer. How did Churchill wage war? And I was interested in it, not least because I knew it was also a question that was of interest to Churchill himself. When the war was finally all over in September 1945, and after he'd lost office in the general election, Winston Churchill flew to Lake Como in northern Italy. And this was meant to be a holiday, a chance to paint, to rest, to recuperate. But he had his own agenda. And as reading matter, the former Prime Minister took with him specially printed volumes of his own still secret official minutes. And we have those volumes in the Churchill archive. And so here, on green paper, in blue-bound volumes, marked as the property of His Majesty's Britannic government, were all of the instructions, statements, and questions with which he'd continuously bombarded all those around him during the course of his premiership. And according to his doctor, Lord Moran, Churchill remained buried in these documents for the entire 5.5-hour air journey, 1 hour for each year of the war, only taking his eyes from the script to light a cigar. But this was about more than reliving past glories and seeking reassurance in the aftermath of the election defeat. Churchill's thoughts were already turning to the future and to the possibility of publishing his personal account of the conflict, his own multi-volume history of the Second World War. And in part, his motivation was to ensure that his wartime leadership was properly understood. People say my speeches after Dunkirk were the thing, but that was only a part, not the chief part, he complained. They forget I made all the main military decisions. So what were those decisions and how were they taken? I wanted to write an archivist's book, to strip away the layers of hindsight and to look at Churchill's leadership in the moment, because it's perhaps a self-evident thing to say, but while waging war, Churchill and his contemporaries did not know how it was going to turn out. And it's an approach that's perhaps best illustrated by a quote from an unpublished memoir by John Martin, a civil servant who joined Churchill's inner team as a private secretary in the spring of 1940. Because when reflecting on those momentous days, Martin was prepared to admit that with the luxury of hindsight, they may have formed the finest hour. But that was not how they'd seemed at the time. Then, he wrote, it had been a time of agony piled on agony. And this brings me to my first point in the first chapter of the book, which is that we need to remember that Churchill was often waging war from a position of weakness. And firstly, political weakness. We forget too easily that he wasn't elected Prime Minister. He was there because the Labour Party would no longer serve under Neville Chamberlain in a national coalition, and because Lord Halifax, the Conservative Foreign Secretary, was not willing to try and lead a wartime government from the House of Lords rather than the Commons. It was a Westminster coup from which he emerged as the only leading Conservative with the popular credibility and the political ability to form a government. And in spite of Churchill's feelings of destiny, this did not mean that he inherited a strong position. Quite the contrary. To form a national coalition, he had to offer places in his war cabinet to his predecessor, Neville Chamberlain, his main political rival, Lord Halifax, and to the Labour leaders, Arthur Greenwood and Clement Attlee, who he'd spent much of the recent past attacking. He may have had public support, but he did not have a political power base in Westminster. Indeed, as we all know, there was a lot of concern and a lot of sniping. The wonderfully named General Sir Edmund Ironside, Chief of the Imperial General Staff, observed in his diary that Churchill's physique must be marvellous, but I cannot think that he would make a good Prime Minister. He's not got the stability necessary for guiding the others. And Jock Colville, who was already in Downing Street as one of Chamberlain's private secretaries and who would later become a great friend of Churchill, was initially at least equally damning, fearing that with Churchill at the helm, the country may be manoeuvred into the most dangerous position it has ever been in. While Sir Alexander Cadogan, Permanent Under-Secretary of State at the Foreign Office, doubted that we would get a better Prime Minister than Neville Chamberlain. Ian Jacob, a member of the War Cabinet Secretariat who had to administer the Military Coordination Committee, on which Churchill served as First Lord of the Admiralty in early 1940, highlighted the problem posed by Churchill's forceful personality, a combustible mix of eloquence, self-confidence and energy with a tendency to dominate that didn't always make him a congenial colleague. And Jacob reflected that Churchill was so much larger in every way than his colleagues on this committee that it ran like a coach with one wheel twice the size of the other three and achieved very little with much friction. So how did Churchill deal with this on becoming Prime Minister? How did he respond to this position of weakness? Well, his first act, of course, was to make himself not just Prime Minister, but also to make himself Minister of Defence, the country's first Minister of Defence. And in his war memoirs, he downplayed the significance of this change. Yet to Major General Sir Hastings Ismay, the Chief of Staff to this new role, this was Churchill's first and most far-reaching change. It mattered because of the power vested in this new office, when and only when it was combined with that of the Prime Minister, unifying in one person the oversight of the political and military direction of the war. And of course, as such, it was a radical break with the position prior to May 1940. The military chiefs of staff were now reporting directly to Churchill. He was chairing the key defence committee on operations. He could and did attend the meetings of the chiefs of staff himself, and when he wasn't there, he was represented by Ismay at all their deliberations. He was putting himself deliberately above the other civilian ministers concerned with the armed forces, above the Secretaries of State for War and Air, and above the First Lord of the Admiralty. And these ministers were now demoted from the War Cabinet and relegated to subordinate roles, dealing with questions primarily of administration and supply. Churchill had made it clear that he was not going to play the chairman's role, sitting above the fray and adjudicating on matters only when they reached the top. He was going to get his hands dirty. He was going to be an active chief executive. The position also allowed him to amalgamate the political machinery of Number 10 with the Secretariat of the War Cabinet, and to add in his own people like Brendan Bracken, Lindemann and Morton, and to create a much larger and more formidable machine at the centre for running the war. He called it his secret circle, and he made good use of it. Now he was no longer the oversized wheel. Now he was the engine at the centre of the machine, and the whole system could be geared around him. And as we know, he used it, sending out a constant stream of orders, but interestingly, all in writing. He didn't want people to assume what his wishes were. He wanted people to know, and he wanted them to act. It was about words becoming actions. My second chapter looks at the way in which this system was immediately tested by the crisis in France. Churchill became Prime Minister on the 10th of May 1940, the very day that Hitler launches his blitzkrieg offensive against France and the Low Countries. Neither the new Prime Minister nor any of his secret circle could have anticipated how quickly the military situation would deteriorate. The whole military strategy of the Allies in 1940 had been predicated on the fact that the French army, assisted by the much smaller British Expeditionary Force, would be able to hold the Germans in Belgium and northern France. When German armour, supported by dive bombers, came crashing through the Ardennes forest, simply bypassing the defence of the Maginot Line, the whole plan unravelled, opening up a huge gap in the Allied flank, so that within days the situation was desperate. Churchill was still constructing his cabinet. He'd had no time at all to bed in, and now he was faced with a hugely difficult dilemma. On the one hand, he wanted to fight and felt a duty to support his ally. On the other, he realised that every man killed, boat sunk, or most crucially, fighter plane shot down was not going to be available for the defence of Britain. What I try and do is to look at how he navigated this crisis. And one of my conclusions is that he does so much more consultatively than he's often given credit for. When Lord Halifax proposes exploring possible peace terms through the mediation of Italy, the subject matter for the Darkest Hour movie, Churchill does not descend into the underworld of the underground to have his resolve stiffened by ordinary Londoners. Instead, he has the matter thoroughly talked out and debated over 3 days and 4 War Cabinet meetings to make sure he is taking his coalition with him, while also winning the time to secure the support of the Chiefs of Staff for his policy of fighting on. He has to win that argument in several different forums simultaneously, and the pressures on him must have been immense. It is British weakness in the aftermath of the fall of France that influences Churchill's war strategy going forward. Churchill has promised victory, but how's he going to deliver it? From September 1940, London is being hammered by the Blitz. From the 7th of September, it's bombed for 76 consecutive nights, excepting only the 2nd of November. No one knows whether a modern city can survive such a sustained and heavy bombardment from the air. And both Churchill and Ismay describe a visit to a London bomb site by the Prime Minister, though they put it in slightly different locations. But they both agree that when Churchill's car arrives at the scene, he doesn't know how he's going to be received. It must have been a moment of nerve-wracking tension, because the arrival of the Prime Minister has quickly attracted a crowd, and he doesn't know how they're going to react. Would their grief and their anger be directed against him and the establishment for leading them into such peril and for failing to provide better protection? Instead, what happens, according to Ismay, is, "Good old Winnie," they cried. "We thought you'd come and see us. We can take it." and then give it 'em back. And in Churchill's account, he notes how, as he departed, a harsher mood swept over this haggard crowd. "Give it 'em back," they cried, "and let them have it too." I undertook forthwith to see that their wishes were carried out, and this promise was certainly kept. Alas for poor humanity. Now, no doubt Churchill told this story because it chimed in with his own attacking instincts. And this, in a way, is the real underground moment. But it's one thing to commit yourself to waging war. It is another thing to actually deliver an offensive in 1940. How do you give it them back? Churchill's options are severely limited. How is he going to take the fight to the enemy? If you look around in 1940, Britain cannot hope to fight in France other than with small-scale commando operations or special operation executive raids, and you'll be hearing more about those shortly. And of course, those he certainly encourages. We can bomb Germany, and Churchill starts authorizing bombing raids from the moment that he's in Downing Street. But we lack strength, and it's clear that it's going to take time to build up our capacity and to build up our bomber forces, while the Germans and the Luftwaffe can hit us far more easily and effectively. So, the one theatre where he can take the fight to the enemy, where he does have troops and he does have a fleet, is the Mediterranean, especially once the Italians are in the war. And for Churchill, this is where he can take the offensive. Yes, he's a lifelong imperialist, and yes, he's not ready to cede the British position in Malta and Egypt and Palestine, but he also knows the Mediterranean well, and he chooses it as a viable battleground. His decision is a logical one, but it carries huge implications, because once you start fighting in the Mediterranean, it's going to be difficult to get out, especially once the Germans move down, as they inevitably do, into Yugoslavia and Greece. And if you divert resources to the Mediterranean, you're doing it at the expense of other theatres. General Dill, as chief of the Imperial General Staff, argues for the defence of Singapore, reminding Churchill that it's always been the priority for British administrations to guarantee the defence of Australia and New Zealand, something that Churchill himself has signed up to in the past. But the Prime Minister now argues emphatically that we have to fight the actual war in front of us, not the hypothetical battle that may not yet come. And besides, he argues, if the Japanese try and attack in the Far East, they will have to deal with the American Pacific Fleet, which therefore ultimately guarantees British security. Of course, unfortunately for Churchill, the Japanese come to the same conclusion and provide their own answer. In chapter 4 of the book, I look at the whole question of fighting with allies and how Churchill came to co-create the Atlantic Charter in an attempt to move the Americans closer to war, only then to suddenly and unexpectedly find himself in alliance with the Soviet Union after the German attack into Russia. It's a period that is perhaps best summed up by two quotations, both recorded by Jock Colville, Churchill's private secretary, in his diary. On Churchill's courtship of the American president, Colville records the Prime Minister as saying, "No lover ever studied every whim of his mistress as I did those of President Roosevelt." While in his justification for his support for the Soviet Union after the German invasion, Churchill remarked that if Hitler invaded hell, I would at least make a favourable reference to the devil in the House of Commons. But the point is that Churchill had no choice but to almost simultaneously embrace the principles and ideals of the 1941 Atlantic Charter and the realpolitik of the 1942 Anglo-Soviet Treaty, even though it was clear from the outset that they would pull in opposite directions. Did the defeated nations have the right to determine their own form of government? Should Poland be forced to cede territory to the Soviet Union against her will? How might a policy of assigning spheres of influence in Balkan countries be reconciled with the clauses of the Charter opposing territorial aggrandizement and interference? Churchill was clearly aware of the challenges, but in the short term, he knew that he needed both the United States and Russia. His heart yearned to bring the Americans into the conflict. His head knew that he had to keep the Soviets there. Chapters 5 and 6 look at how Churchill responded to a most difficult period in the war. Again, we tend to focus a lot on 1940 nowadays, so that we forget how long the war was and how bleak some of the later periods were. The fall of Singapore in February 1942 had the power to do the Prime Minister real harm. It certainly came as a huge shock to him. This is one of the telegrams that survives in the archive, sent on the 10th of February, urging that Singapore be fought to the last man. And if you look at his telegrams and his writings from this period, you can see that how much he sort of misunderstands the geography of Singapore. He describes the island as being like a fortress, and he describes the Straits of Malay as being like a gorge. And of course, if any of you have been there, it's certainly not a gorge. It's a long, rather flat, easily crossable stretch of water. And the fall of Singapore coincided with a renewed offensive by Rommel in the North African desert, and it coincided with the escape on the 12th of February of the powerful German battle cruisers Scharnhorst and Gneisenau, along with the cruiser Prince Eugen, when they slipped undetected from their moorings at Brest and made their way brazenly up the channel to safety in Germany without being sunk, having only been belatedly detected and attacked by the Royal Navy and RAF. So it looked at the time as though Britain was being outsmarted in every theatre, and public opinion was outraged. Cadogan felt it to be one of the blackest periods of the war, and Churchill later conceded that it was certainly not strange that public confidence in the administration and its conduct of the war should have quavered. And of course, he found himself attacked and criticised from all sides. To the Prime Minister of Australia, John Curtin, the loss of Singapore was always going to be an inexcusable betrayal. And viewed from Australia and New Zealand, Britain should clearly have done more to secure Singapore's defence. Yet, as the War Cabinet noted on the 16th of February, as soon as Singapore had fallen, in retrospect, it now seemed a pity that we'd sent the 18th Division there. Churchill was simultaneously vulnerable to the charges of not having done enough to reinforce Singapore, and then of only having sent reinforcements when it was too late for them to be effective. The same was arguably true of his decision to send the battleship Prince of Wales, which was sunk by Japanese air attack along with HMS Repulse on the 10th of December. Not only had the Prime Minister insisted on the ship's dispatch, but he'd also chosen to publicise the fact as a deterrent to Japan and as a reassurance to Australia and New Zealand. General Brooke, a not always uncritical observer of Churchill, noted in his diary for the 16th of February, the day after the fall of Singapore, that the Prime Minister was on the whole in a very good mood, and he later reflected, this was typical of Winston. In a real crisis, he was always at his best and stood all the heavy shocks without flinching. And what I look at is how Churchill managed this crisis. And he managed it by facing down the growing opposition in Parliament, by allowing a debate, by calling a confidence vote, but also by cleverly restructuring his war cabinet. He brings in the socialist politician Stafford Cripps, the former ambassador to the Soviet Union, whose growing popularity threatened to undermine Churchill. And by making Cripps leader of the House and responsible for managing government business, he cleverly ties him into his own administration. It's true he bows to pressure to create a new Ministry of Production, but he deftly avoids all attempts and calls to strip him of his own role as Minister of Defence. And I think time and again, when you look in detail at key moments like this during the war, what you see is actually how tactical a politician Churchill could be. But of course, none of that meant anything if we didn't have victories in the field. And up to the summer of 1942, we'd been defeated in Norway, in France, in Greece, and now in the Far East. Churchill sacked General Auchinleck in the summer of 1942 because he believed that the Eighth Army had become demoralized. But he also did it because he needed at that moment to send a strong signal to both the Americans and the Russians that Britain could and would fight in the Mediterranean. Roosevelt and Stalin were both pushing for a second front in France. Churchill needed to finish what had been started there, and he was rightly skeptical about doing something too early or too small scale in Northern Europe. He knew that it was going to take time to build up the forces for a proper operation against the Atlantic Sea Wall. And so a theme running throughout the book is that Churchill's key decisions have to be seen as the products of the specific time, place, and context in which they were made. Thus, the policy of unconditional surrender must be seen in the context of the Casablanca Conference that coined it. The insistence on the complete surrender of Germany, Italy, and Japan, even if their regimes changed, has been criticized by some for potentially prolonging the war by undermining internal resistance within those countries to their fascist regimes. But in early 1943, in the absence of a second front in France, Churchill and Roosevelt needed to send a strong signal to Stalin, who'd not attended the meeting in Morocco. And they needed to send a signal that they would not seek a separate peace with Hitler. With only limited gains in North Africa and no easy end to the war yet in sight, they also wanted a message that would bolster domestic morale while simultaneously sending a clear response to the horrific information that was now starting to come across their desks about the Nazi atrocities being committed against the Jews. The decision to travel to Athens for Christmas 1944 to broker a peace between the warring nationalist and communist factions must be seen in the light of the agreement negotiated between Churchill and Stalin in Moscow 2 months earlier, at which the Soviet leader had apparently agreed to Greece remaining a British sphere of influence. To Churchill, who had not become the King's First Minister to preside over the liquidation of the British Empire, the communist insurgency was much more than a local difficulty. It was a litmus test of Russian good faith, and it was about preserving British influence and prestige in the Mediterranean. And that was something, of course, that Churchill had been fighting for since 1940. What comes through the contemporary accounts is that Churchill was never happier than when in the midst of a crisis. Conversely, what he hated was periods of inactivity. And you can see this most clearly in the months running up to D-Day. The diaries of Brooke and Cadogan for the first half of 1944 record their personal frustrations with the Prime Minister, and do so in terms that often reflect on his declining physical health. To Cadogan, Churchill was complaining of his legs and could no longer walk or even stand for very long. He was flushed, he was very woolly, he was not the man he was 12 months ago, and was rambling without a pause. And at times, the Under-Secretary of State longs for the more organised and dispassionate chairmanship of Chamberlain. While Brooke speculated that the Prime Minister might not last 3 months, he was failing fast, was dull, lifeless, and missing the main points, and at other times it seemed as if Churchill had lost all balance, so that Brooke felt as though he were chained to the chariot of a lunatic. Now, of course, perhaps those observations tell us as much about the pressures on Brooke and Cadogan as they do about those on Churchill, but it is undoubtedly a very difficult period for him, and I think that is because it's a period of enforced activity. He is waiting for D-Day to happen. He is frustrated with the strategy. He wants to be going forward in the Mediterranean, but of course at the Tehran conference, Roosevelt and Stalin have dug in. How did Churchill respond? Well, he didn't take to his bed and have a nervous breakdown, as one recent movie would have you believe. No, his response was to seek the stimulus of action. And of course, after D-Day, he was finally able to cross over on the beaches on D-Day +6, where he observed the synthetic harbours in action, stepped ashore from a landing craft, drove to Montgomery's headquarters, toured the Allied bridgehead, and finished a most interesting and enjoyable day in the British destroyer HMS Kelvin, firing on the enemy. Thereafter, it was difficult to keep him away from the action, and he was back in Normandy from the 20th to the 23rd of July, and there again on the 7th of August. And as he told the king, a man who has to play an effective part in taking with the highest responsibility grave and terrible decisions of war may need the refreshment of adventure. He may need also the comfort that when sending so many others to their death, he may share in a small way their risks. My final chapter, though, looks at why Churchill fought the 1945 election at all, and, having decided to do so, against Clementine's advice, why he chose to fight it so badly. Now, exhaustion clearly played a part, but I don't think it's the whole answer. I argue that he lost partly because he was a fighter and because he couldn't stop fighting. The very thing that made him such an effective war leader on the international front caused him to misjudge the public mood on the home front. Here, during the election, he should have been playing the chairman's role. He should have been staying above the political fray and presenting himself as the national saviour and the candidate of unity, which is what the Conservative Party expected him to do. Instead, he said he was not ready to be put on a pedestal, and he threw himself into vicious political attacks on the Labour Party. And of course, in part, this was a return to his political roots. Churchill had been a passionate opponent of socialism throughout his political career. Even in his most radical phase as a young Liberal politician in 1908, he'd castigated socialism as a barren philosophy that sought to pull down wealth, destroy private interests, kill enterprise, assail the preeminence of the individual, exalt the rule rather than the man, and attack capital. As a Conservative Chancellor of the Exchequer in the 1920s, he'd led government opposition to the general strike. Now, Leo Amery felt that there was no getting round the fact that he, Churchill, is essentially a mid-Victorian Whig, and he means to fight the election on the purely negative tack of the socialist bogey. It was a conviction that must have been strengthened by Churchill's current view of the international scene, where he saw communist forces seeking to install themselves in Albania, Greece, Italy, Poland, and Yugoslavia, and where he feared a consequent loss of democratic freedoms. The rhetoric and language he'd used to condemn the aspirations and actions of the communists in Greece was still fresh in his mind and on his tongue. He was also finally free from the constraints of coalition and able to respond to some of his most vociferous critics on the left, people like Anurin Bevan and Harold Lasky, whom he felt had been undermining his foreign policy and his premiership. It may have been a big leap to argue that the British Parliamentary Labour Party would lead inexorably to Soviet-style communism, but Churchill was seeking to present an alternative vision for the future of Britain. And this, I think, went to the heart of why he'd become Prime Minister and why he'd waged war for 5 long years. He'd been fighting to preserve British independence and the empire, but also British liberties. Rather than a break with the past, he was looking for continuity. Thus, in his final election broadcast, he looked back to the Britain of September 1939, arguing that it was already peopled by a far stronger, healthier, better bred, better led, better housed, and better educated race than had been the case before the First World War. Britain did not need a brave new world. She needed to be able to return and pick up where she'd been forced to leave off. And when Churchill's doctor, Lord Moran, told him that there were 2 opposing ideas in the country and that universal gratitude to him was tempered by the notion that he was not keen on this brave new world business, Churchill replied, "The desire for a new world is nothing like universal. The gratitude is." He was wrong. Ultimately, Churchill fought and lost the campaign on the principles he believed in, using the only methods he knew. He didn't have the patience, the time, or the energy to adapt his tactics. He fought aggressively because he was a fighter. He kept going because he was not ready to become an icon, believed in his own abilities to do the job, and disliked the alternatives. His conviction and self-belief blinkered him to the changed political reality. By 1945, Anthony Eden had spent 5 years working alongside Winston Churchill. And of the election campaign and Churchill's failure to see beyond the cheers of the crowds, he wrote, "He could not be expected to sense that there was something valedictory in their message. He would not have been Winston Churchill if he had." So, to my mind, the Churchill that comes through from my research is less omniscient, less dictatorial, but more political, more tactical, and more human. His preferred response, I think, to the decisions and the crises he faced was to live in the moment, to prioritize, debate, and then act upon the evidence in front of him. Many of those who worked most closely with him spoke about his ability to find and focus on what was most important. And Lord Moran recalled Clementine telling him that Winston always saw things in blinkers. His eyes are focused on the point he is determined to attain. He sees nothing outside that beam. But I think Churchill gambled that one success would lead to another. This was about seizing the moment. The key to victory was to keep moving forward, one battle at a time. That was how Winston waged war, nor did he pretend it was otherwise. Speaking to the Commons on the 27th of February 1945, in the aftermath of the Yalta Conference, he reflected on his role. In 1940 to 41, when we in this island were all alone and invasion was so near, the actual steps we ought to take seemed plain and simple. If a man is coming across the sea to kill you, you do everything in your power to make sure that he dies before he finishes his journey. That may be difficult and painful, but it is at least simple. Now we enter into a world of imponderables, and at every stage occasions for self-questioning arise. It is a mistake to look too far ahead. Only one link in the chain of destiny can be handled at a time. And I think it was by keeping his eyes fixed on strengthening the individual links that Churchill helped to forge that chain which led to victory. Thank you. I'm being told that there's time for one question. So, who would like to go for it? Any questions? Question over there. I think there's a microphone just coming to you, sir.
I'll give it a try. Jay Christensen from Los Angeles, and formerly with California State University, Northridge, and a believer of Churchill to the point that I even gave a talk on Are You a True Churchillian to the retreat of the Plato Society of Los Angeles. My question is about Norway. Did Churchill take too much time trying to get the troops into Norway so that the British, unfortunately, were going to have some kind of failure?
I think there are probably others that can answer in here who would be able to give a better and a more detailed answer to that question than I can. My take on it is that the problem with Norway, of course, is that Churchill is First Lord of the Admiralty. He is by far the most bellicose member of Chamberlain's war cabinet at that point. He's very active. He is dominating the Military Coordination Committee, although he's not supposed to actually be initially at least, chairing that committee, and he's driving forward action. I think one of the problems is that at that point, he has the will, he has the drive, and he has the energy, but he doesn't yet have the executive authority to act. And of course, one of the problems with Norway, and one of the lessons that I think is learned from Norway, is about coordination between the different services, between the Navy and the Army. And so I think Churchill undoubtedly has to take some of the blame for Norway, but of course he doesn't have the power to drive through the operation in the way that he would have liked. And of course, he subsequently drove his Chief of the Imperial General Staff, General Brooke, mad by at every opportunity wanting to go back into Norway.